Chapter 24. I am reduced to a great misery, assaulted on Tower Hill by a press gang, who put me on board a tender, my usage there, my arrival on board at a man-of-war, where I am put in irons, and released by the good offices of Mr. Thompson, who recommends me as assistant to the surgeon. He relates his own story, characters of the captain, surgeon, and first mate. I applauded the resolution of Miss Williams, who a few days after, was hired in quality of barkeeper, by one of the ladies who had witnessed in her behalf at the Marshalsea, and who since that time had got credit with a wine merchant, whose favourite she was, to set up a convenient house of her own. Thither my fellow lodger repaired, after having taken leave of me with a torrent of tears, and 1,000 protestations of eternal gratitude, assuring me she would remain in this situation no longer than she could pick up money sufficient to put her other design in execution. As for my own part, I saw no resource but the army or navy, between which I hesitated so long that I found myself reduced to a starving condition. My spirit began to accommodate itself to my beggarly fate, and I became so mean as to go down towards Wapping, with an intention to inquire for an old schoolfellow I understood had got the command of a small coasting vessel then in the river, and implore his assistance. But my destiny prevented this abject piece of behavior, for as I crossed Tower Wharf, a squat tawny fellow with a hanger by his side, and a cudgel in his hand came up to me, calling, "Yo-ho! Brother, you must come along with me." As I did not like his appearance, instead of answering his salutation, I quickened my pace, in hope of ridding myself of his company, upon which he whistled aloud, and immediately another sailor appeared before me, who laid hold of me by the collar, and began to drag me along. Not being in a humor to relish such treatment, I disengaged myself of the assailant, and, with one blow of my cudgel, laid him motionless on the ground, and perceiving myself surrounded in a trice by 10 or a dozen more, exerted myself with such dexterity and success, that some of my opponents were fain to attack me with drawn cutlasses, and after an obstinate engagement, in which I received a large wound on my head, and another on my left cheek, I was disarmed, taken prisoner, and carried on board a pressing tender, where, after being pinioned like a malefactor, I was thrust down into the hold among a parcel of miserable wretches, the sight of whom well nigh distracted me. As the commanding officer had not humanity enough to order my wounds to be dressed, and I could not use my own hands, I desired one of my fellow captives who was unfettered, to take a handkerchief out of my pocket, and tie it round my head, to stop the bleeding. He pulled out my handkerchief, 'tis true, but instead of applying it to the use for which I designed it, went to the grating of the hatchway, and, with astonishing composure, sold it before my face to a bumboat woman, then on board, for a quart of gin, with which he treated his companions, regardless of my circumstances and entreaties. A bumboat woman is one who sells bread, cheese, greens, liquor, and fresh potatoes to the sailors. In a small boat that lies alongside the ship I complained bitterly of this robbery to the midshipman on deck, telling him at the same time, that unless my hurts were dressed, I should bleed to death. But compassion was a weakness of which no man could justly accuse this person, squirting a mouthful of dissolved tobacco upon me through the gratings, told me I was a mutinous dog, and that I might die for anything he cared. Finding there was no other remedy, I appealed to patience, and laid up this usage in my memory, to be called at a more fitting opportunity. In the meantime, loss of blood, vexation, and want of food, contributed, with the noisome stench of the place, to throw me into a swoon, out of which I was recovered by a tweak of the nose, administered by the tar who stood sentinel over us, who at the same time regaled me with a draught of flip, and comforted me with the hopes of being put on board of the Thunder next day, where I should be freed of my handcuffs, and cured of my wounds by the doctor. I no sooner heard him name the Thunder, than I asked if he had belonged to that ship long, and be giving me to understand he had belonged to her 5 years, I inquired if he knew Lieutenant Bowling. "No, Lieutenant Bowling," said he, "odds my life. And that I do, and a good seaman he is as ever stepped upon forecastle, and a brave fellow as ever cracked biscuit, none of your guinea pigs, nor your fresh water, wish-washy, fair-weather fowls. Many a taut gale of wind have honest Tom Bowling and I weathered together. Here's his health, with all my heart, wherever he is, aloft or alow, the lieutenant needs not be ashamed to show himself. I was so much affected with this eulogium, that I could not refrain from telling him that I was Lieutenant Bowling's kinsman, in consequence of which connection, he expressed his inclination to serve me, and when he was relieved, brought some cold boiled beef in a platter, and biscuit, on which we supped plentifully, and afterwards drank another can of flip together. While we were thus engaged, he recounted a great many exploits of my uncle, who, I found, was very much beloved by the ship's company, and pitied for the misfortune that had happened to him in Hispaniola, which I was very glad to be informed was not so great as I imagined, for Captain Oakham had recovered of his wounds, and actually at that time commanded the ship. Having by accident, in my pocket, my uncle's letter, written from Port Louis, I gave it my benefactor, whose name was Jack Ratlin, for his perusal, but honest Jack told me frankly he could not read, and desired to know the contents, which I immediately communicated. When he heard that part of it in which he says he had written to his landlord in Deal, he cried, "Body o' me! That was old Ben Block, he was dead before the letter came to hand." Had Ben been alive, Lieutenant Bowling would have had no occasion to skulk so long. Honest Ben was the first man that taught him to hand, reef, and steer. Well, we must all die, that's certain. We must all come to port sooner or later, at sea or on shore, we must be fast moored one day, death's like the best bower anchor, as the saying is, it will bring us all up. I could not but signify my approbation of the justness of Jack's reflections, and inquired into the occasion of the quarrel between Captain Oakham and my uncle, which he explained in this manner: Captain Oakham, to be sure, is a good man enough, besides, he's my commander, but what's that to me? I do my duty, and value no man's anger of a rope's end. Now the report goes, as how he's a lord, or baron knight's brother, whereby, d'ye see me, he carries a straight arm, and keeps aloof from his officers, though mayhap they may be as good men in the main as he. Now we lying at anchor in Toubron Bay, Lieutenant Bowling had the middle watch, and as he always kept a good look out, he made, d'ye see, 3 lights in the offing, whereby he ran down to the great cabin for orders, and found the captain asleep, whereupon he waked him, which put him in a main high passion, and he swore woundily at the lieutenant, and called him lousy Scotch son of a whore, for, I being then sentinel in the steerage, heard all, and swab, and lubber, whereby the lieutenant returned the salute, and they jawed together fore and aft a good spell, till at last the captain turned out, and, laying hold of a rattan, came athwart Mr. Bowling's quarter, whereby he told the captain that, if he was not his commander, he would heave him overboard, and demanded satisfaction ashore, whereby in the morning watch, the captain went ashore in the pinnace, and afterwards the lieutenant carried the cutter ashore, and so they, leaving the boat's crews on their oars, went away together, and so, d'ye see, in less than a quarter of an hour we heard firing, whereby we made for the place, and found the captain lying wounded on the beach, and so brought him on board to the doctor, who cured him in less than 6 weeks. But the lieutenant clapped on all the sail he could bear, and had got far enough ahead before we knew anything of the matter, so that we could never after get sight of him, for which we were not sorry, because the captain was mainly wrath, and would certainly have done him a mischief, for he afterwards caused him to be run on the ship's books, whereby he lost all his pay, and, if he should be taken, would be tried as a deserter. This account of the captain's behavior gave me no advantageous idea of his character, and I could not help lamenting my own fate, that had subjected me to such a commander. However, making a virtue of necessity, I put a good face on the matter, and next day, was, with the other pressed men, put on board of the Thunder, lying at the Nore. When we came alongside, the mate, who guarded us thither, ordered my handcuffs to be taken off, that I might get on board the easier, this circumstance being perceived by some of the company who stood upon the gangboard to see us enter. One of them called to Jack Ratlin, who was busied in doing this friendly office for me, "Hey, Jack, what Newgate galley have you boarded in the river as you came along? Have we not thieves enow among us already?" Another, observing my wounds, which remained exposed to the air, told me, my seams were uncaulked, and that I must be new paid. A third, seeing my hair clotted together with blood, as it were into distinct cords, took notice that my bows were mended with the red ropes, instead of my side. A fourth asked me if I could not keep my yard square without iron braces. And, in short, 1,000 witticisms of the same nature were passed upon me before I could get up the ship's side. After we had been all entered upon the ship's books, I inquired of one of my shipmates where the surgeon was, that I might have my wounds dressed, and had actually got as far as the middle deck, for our ship carried 80 guns, in my way to the cockpit, when I was met by the same midshipman who had used me so barbarously in the tender. He, seeing me free from my chains, asked, with an insolent air, who had released me? To this question, I foolishly answered, with a countenance that too plainly declared the state of my thoughts, whoever did it, I am persuaded did not consult you in the affair. I had no sooner uttered these words, than he cried, "Damn you, you saucy son of a hitch, I'll teach you to talk so to your officer." So saying, he bestowed on me several severe stripes with a supple jack he had in his hand, and, going to the commanding officer, made such a report of me, that I was immediately put in irons by the master-at-arms, and a sentinel placed over me. Honest Ratlin, as soon as he heard of my condition, came to me, and administered all the consolation he could, and then went to the surgeon in my behalf, who sent one of his mates to dress my wounds. This mate was no other than my old friend Thompson, with whom I became acquainted at the Navy Office, as before mentioned. If I knew him at first sight, it was not easy for him to recognize me, disfigured with blood and dirt, and altered by the misery I had undergone. Unknown as I was to him, he surveyed me with looks of compassion, and handled my sores with great tenderness. When he had applied what he thought proper, and was about to leave me, I asked him if my misfortunes had disguised me so much that he could not recollect my face. Upon this address he observed me with great earnestness for some time, and at length protested he could not recollect one feature of my countenance. To keep him no longer in suspense, I told him my name, which when he heard, he embraced me with affection, and professed his sorrow at seeing me in such a disagreeable situation. I made him acquainted with my story, and, when he heard how inhumanly I had been used in the tender, he left me abruptly, assuring me I should see him again soon. I had scarce time to wonder at his sudden departure, when the master-at-arms came to the place of my confinement, and bade me follow him to the quarter-deck, where I was examined by the first lieutenant, who commanded the ship in the absence of the captain, touching the treatment I had received in the tender from my friend the midshipman, who was present to confront me. I recounted the particulars of his behavior to me, not only in the tender, but since my being on board the ship, part of which being proved by the evidence of Jack Ratlin and others, who had no great devotion for my oppressor. I was discharged from confinement, to make way for him, who was delivered to the master-at-arms to take his turn in the bilboes. And this was not the only satisfaction I enjoyed, for I was, at the request of the surgeon, exempted from all other duty than that of assisting his mates, in making and administering medicines to the sick. This good office I owed to the friendship of Mr. Thompson, who had represented me in such a favorable light to the surgeon, that he demanded me of the lieutenant to supply the place of his third mate, who was lately dead. When I had obtained this favor, my friend Thompson carried me down to the cockpit, which is the place allotted for the habitation of the surgeon's mates, and when he had shown me their berth, as he called it, I was filled with astonishment and horror. We descended by divers ladders to a space as dark as a dungeon, which, I understood, was immersed several feet under water, being immediately above the hold. I had no sooner approached this dismal gulf, than my nose was saluted with an intolerable stench of putrefied cheese and rancid butter, that issued from an apartment at the foot of the ladder, resembling a chandler's shop, where, by the faint glimmering of a candle, I could perceive a man with a pale, meagre countenance, sitting behind a kind of desk, having spectacles on his nose, and a pen in his hand. This, I learned of Mr. Thompson, was the ship's steward, who sat there to distribute provision to the several messes, and to mark what each received. He therefore presented my name to him, and desired I might be entered in his mess, then, taking a light in his hand, conducted me to the place of his residence, which was a square of about 6 feet, surrounded with the medicine chest, that of the first mate, his own, and a board by way of table fastened to the after powder room, it was also enclosed with canvas nailed round to the beams of the ship, to screen us from the cold, as well as from the view of the midshipman and quartermaster, who lodged within the cable tiers on each side of us. In this gloomy mansion he entertained me with some cold suit pork, which he brought from a sort of locker, fixed above the table, and calling for the boy of the mess, sent for a can of beer, of which he made excellent flip to crown the banquet. By this time I began to recover my spirits, which had been exceedingly depressed with the appearance of everything about me, and could no longer refrain from asking the particulars of Mr. Thompson's fortune since I had seen him in London. He told me, that being disappointed in his expectations of borrowing money to gratify the rapacious S.T. Re at the Navy Office, he found himself utterly unable to subsist any longer in town, and had actually offered his service, in quality of mate, to the surgeon of a merchant ship, bound to Guinea on the slaving trade, when, one morning, a young fellow, of whom he had some acquaintance, came to his lodgings, and informed him that he had seen a warrant made out in his name at the Navy Office for surgeon's second mate of a third rate. This unexpected piece of good news he could scarcely believe to be true, more especially as he had been found qualified at Surgeon's Hall for third mate only, but that he might not be wanting to himself, he went thither to be assured, and actually found it so, whereupon, demanding his warrant, it was delivered to him, and the oaths administered immediately. That very afternoon he went to Gravesend in the tilt-boat, from whence he took place in the tide coach for Rochester, next morning got on board the Thunder, for which he was appointed, then lying in the harbour at Chatham, and the same day was mustered by the clerk of the check. And well it was for him that such expedition was used, for, in less than 12 hours after his arrival, another William Thompson came on board, affirming that he was the person for whom the warrant was expedited, and that the other was an impostor. My friend was grievously alarmed at this accident, the more so, as his namesake had very much the advantage over him both in assurance and dress. However, to acquit himself of the suspicion of imposture, he produced several letters written from Scotland to him in that name, and, recollecting that his indentures were in a box on board, he brought them up, and convinced all present that he had not assumed a name which did not belong to him. His competitor, enraged that they should hesitate in doing him justice, for to be sure the warrant had been designed for him, behaved with so much indecent heat, that the commanding officer, who was the same gentleman I had seen, and the surgeon were offended at his presumption, and making a point of it with their friends in town, in less than a week got the first confirmed in his station. I have been on board, said he, ever since, and, as this way of life is becoming familiar to me, have no cause to complain of my situation. The surgeon is a good-natured, indolent man. The first mate, who is now on shore on duty, is indeed a little proud and choleric, as all Welshmen are, but in the main a friendly honest fellow. The lieutenants I have no concern with, and, as for the captain, he is too much of a gentleman to know a surgeon's mate, even by sight. Chapter 25, The Behaviour of Mr. Morgan, His Pride, Displeasure, and Generosity, the Economy of our Mess described, Thompson's further friendship, the nature of my duty explained, the situation of the sick. While he was thus discoursing to me, we heard a voice on the cockpit ladder pronounce with great vehemence, in a strange dialect, "The devil and his dam blow me from the top of Munchdenny, if I go to him before there is something in my pelly. Let his nose be as yellow as saffron, or as blue as a pell, look you, or as green as a leek, 'tis all one." To this declaration somebody answered, "So it seems my poor messmate must part his cable for want of a little assistance. His foretopsail is loose already, and besides the doctor ordered you to overhaul him, but I see you don't mind what your master says." Here he was interrupted with, splutter and cons. "You lousy tog, who do you call my master? Get you gone to the doctor, and tell him my birth, and education, and my abilities, and moreover, my behavior is as good as his, or any gentleman's, no disparagement to him, in the whole world. God bless my soul, I does he think, or conceive, or imagine, that I am a horse, or an ass, or a goat, to trudge backwards and forwards, and upwards and downwards, and by sea and by land, at his will and pleasure. Go your ways, you rapscallion, and tell Dr. Atkins that I desire and request that he will give a look upon the dying man, and order something for him, if he be dead or alive, and I will see him take it by and by, when my craving stomach is satisfied, look you. At this, the other went away, saying, that if they should serve him so when he was dying, by God he would be foul of them in the other world. Here Mr. Thompson let me know, that the person we heard was Mr. Morgan, the first mate, who was just come on board from the hospital, whither he had attended some of the sick in the morning. At the same time I saw him come into the berth. He was a short thick man, with a face garnished with pimples, a snub nose turned up at the end, an excessive wide mouth, and little fiery eyes, surrounded with skin puckered up in innumerable wrinkles. My friend immediately made him acquainted with my case, when he regarded me with a very lofty look, but without speaking, set down a bundle he had in his hand, and approached the cupboard, which, when he had opened, he exclaimed in a great passion, "Cot is my life, all the pork is gone, as I am a Christian." Thompson then gave him to understand, that, as I had been brought on board half famished, he could do no less than to entertain me with what was in the locker, and the rather as he had bid the steward enter me in the mess. Whether this disappointment made Mr. Morgan more peevish than usual, or he really thought himself too little regarded by his fellow mate, I know not, but after some pause, he went on in this manner, "Mr. Thompson, perhaps you do not use me with all the good manners, and complaisance, and respect, look you, that becomes you, because you have not vouchsafed to advise with me in this affair. I have in my time, look you, been a man of some weight, and substance, and consideration, and have kept house and home, and paid scot and lot, and the king's taxes, and maintained a family to boot. And moreover, also, I am your senior, and your older, and your petter, Mr. Thompson." "My elder, I'll allow you to be, but not my better," cried Thompson, with some heat. "Cot is my savior, and witness too," said Morgan, with great vehemence, "that I am more elder, and therefore more petter by many years than you." Fearing this dispute might be attended with some bad consequence, I interposed, and told Mr. Morgan I was very sorry for having been the occasion of any difference between him and the second mate, and that, rather than cause the least breach in their good understanding, would eat my allowance to myself, or seek admission into some other company. But Thompson, with more spirit than discretion, as I thought, insisted upon my remaining where he had appointed me, and observed that no man, possessed of generosity and compassion, would have any objection to it, considering my birth and talents, and the misfortunes I had of late so unjustly undergone. This was touching Mr. Morgan on the right key, who protested with great earnestness, that he had no objection to my being received in the mess, but only complained that the ceremony of asking his consent was not observed. "As for a Sheltonman in distress," said he, shaking me by the hand, "I loaf him as I loaf my own powels, for, God help me, I have had vexations enough upon my own pack." And as I afterwards learned, in so saying, he spoke no more than what was true, for he had been once settled in a very good situation in Glamorganshire, and was ruined by being security for an acquaintance. All differences being composed, he untied his bundle, which consisted of 3 bunches of onions, and a great lump of Cheshire cheese, wrapped up in a handkerchief, and, taking some biscuit from the cupboard, fell to with a keen appetite, inviting us to share of the repast. When he had fed heartily on his homely fare, he filled a large cup, made of a cocoanut shell, with brandy, and, drinking it off, told us, brandy was the best menstruum for onions and cheese. His hunger being appeased, he began to be in better humor, and, being inquisitive about my birth, no sooner understood that I was descended of a good family, than he discovered a particular goodwill to me on that account, deducing his own pedigree in a direct line from the famous Caractacus, king of the Britons, who was first the prisoner, and afterwards the friend of Claudius Caesar. Perceiving how much I was reduced in point of linen, he made me a present of 2 good ruffled shirts, which, with 2 more of check which I received from Mr. Thompson, enabled me to appear with decency. Meanwhile the sailor, whom Mr. Morgan had sent to the doctor, brought a prescription for his messmate, which when the Welshman had read, he got up to prepare it and asked, if the man was dead or alive. "Dead," replied Jack. "If he was dead, he would have no occasion for doctor's stuff." No, thank God, death haunt as yet boarded him. But they have been yardarm and yardarm these 3 glasses. Are his eyes open? Continued the mate. His starboard eye, said the sailor, is open, but fast jammed in his head, and the halyards of his under jaw have given way. Passion of my heart, cried Morgan, the man is as pad as one would desire to be. Did you feel his pulses? To this the other replied with, Anan. Upon which this Cambro Briton, with great earnestness and humanity, ordered the tar to run to his messmate, and keep him alive till he should come with the medicine, and then, said he, you shall peradventure behold what you shall see. The poor fellow, with great simplicity, ran to the place where the sick man lay, but in less than a minute returned with a waffle countenance, and told us his comrade had struck. Morgan, hearing this, exclaimed, Mercy upon my salvation. Why did you not stop him till I came? Stop him, said the other, I hailed him several times, but he was too far on his way, and the enemy had got possession of his close quarters, so that he did not mind me. Well, well, said he, we all owe heaven a teeth. Go your ways, you ragamuffin, and take an example and a warning, look you, and repent of your misdeeds. So saying, he pushed the seaman out of the berth. While we entertained us with reflections suitable to this event, we heard the boatswain pipe to dinner, and immediately the boy belonging to our mess ran to the locker, from whence he carried off a large wooden platter, and, in a few minutes, returned with it full of boiled peas, crying, scaldings, all the way as he came. The cloth, consisting of a piece of an old sail, was instantly laid, covered with 3 plates, which by the color I could with difficulty discern to be metal, and as many spoons of the same composition, 2 of which were curtailed in the handles, and the other abridged in the lip. Mr. Morgan himself enriched this mess with a lump of salt butter scooped from an old gallipot, and a handful of onions shorn, with some pounded pepper. I was not very much tempted with the appearance of this dish, of which, nevertheless, my messmates ate heartily, advising me to follow their example, as it was banyan day and we could have no meat till next noon. But I had already laid in sufficient for the occasion, and therefore desired to be excused, expressing a curiosity to know the meaning of banyan day. They told me, that, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, the ship's company had no allowance of meat, and that these meager days were called banyan days, the reason of which they did not know, but I have since learned they take their denomination from a sect of devotees in some parts of the East Indies, who never taste flesh. After dinner Thompson led me round the ship, showed me the different parts, described their uses, and, as far as he could, made me acquainted with the particulars of the discipline and economy practiced on board. He then demanded of the boatswain a hammock for me, which was slung in a very neat manner by my friend Jack Ratlin, and, as I had no bed-clothes, procured credit for me with the purser, for a mattress and 2 blankets. At 7 o'clock in the evening Morgan visited the sick, and, having ordered what was proper for each, I assisted Thompson in making up his prescriptions, but when I followed him with the medicines into the sick berth, or hospital, and observed the situation of the patients, I was much less surprised that people should die on board, than that a sick person should recover. Here I saw about 50 miserable distempered wretches, suspended in rows, so huddled one upon another, that not more than 14 inches space was allotted for each with his bed and bedding, and deprived of the light of the day, as well as of fresh air, breathing nothing but a noisome atmosphere of the morbid steams exhaling from their own excrements and diseased bodies, devoured with vermin hatched in the filth that surrounded them, and destitute of every convenience necessary for people in that helpless condition. Chapter 26. A disagreeable accident happens to me in the discharge of my office. Morgan's nose is offended. A dialogue between him and the ship's steward. Upon examination, I find more causes of complaint than one. My hair is cut off. Morgan's cookery. The manner of sleeping on board. I am waked in the night by a dreadful noise. Could not comprehend how it was possible for the attendants to come near those who hung on the inside towards the sides of the ship, in order to assist them, as they seemed barricadoed by those who lay on the outside, and entirely out of the reach of all visitation. Much less could I conceive how my friend Thompson would be able to administer clysters, that were ordered for some, in that situation, when I saw him thrust his wig in his pocket, and strip himself to his waistcoat in a moment, then creep on all fours under the hammocks of the sick, and, forcing up his bare pate between two, keep them asunder with one shoulder, until he had done his duty. Eager to learn the service, I desired he would give me leave to perform the next operation of that kind, and he consenting, I undressed myself after his example, and crawling along, the ship happened to roll. This motion alarming me, I laid hold of the first thing that came within my grasp with such violence, that I overturned it, and soon found, by the smell that issued upon me, that I had unlocked a box of the most delicious perfume. It was well for me that my nose was none of the most delicate, else I know not how I might have been affected by this vapor, which diffused itself all over the ship, to the utter discomposure of everybody who tarried on the same dock. Neither was the consequence of this disgrace confined to my sense of smelling only, for I felt my misfortune more ways than one. That I might not, however, appear altogether disconcerted in this my first essay, I got up, and, pushing my head with great force between two hammocks, towards the middle, where the greatest resistance was, I made an opening indeed, but, not understanding the knack of dexterously turning my shoulder to maintain my advantage, had the mortification to find myself stuck up, as it were, in a pillory, and the weight of 3 or 4 people bearing on each side of my neck, so that I was in danger of strangulation. While I remained in this defenseless posture, one of the sick men, rendered peevish by his distemper, was so enraged at the smell I had occasioned and the rude shock he had received from me in my elevation, that, with many bitter reproaches, he seized me by the nose, which he tweaked so unmercifully, that I roared with anguish. Thompson, perceiving my condition, ordered one of the waiters to my assistance, who, with much difficulty, disengaged me from this situation, and hindered me from taking vengeance on the sick man, whose indisposition would not have screened him from the effects of my indignation. After having made an end of our ministry for that time, we descended to the cockpit, my friend comforting me for what had happened with a homely proverb, which I do not choose to repeat. When we had descended halfway down the ladder, Mr. Morgan, before he saw us, having intelligence by his nose of the approach of something extraordinary, cried, "God have mercy upon my senses! I believe the enemy has ported us in a stinkpot." Then, directing his discourse to the steward, from whence he imagined the odor proceeded, he reprimanded him severely for the freedoms he took among gentlemen of birth, and threatened to smoke him like a padger with sulphur, if ever he should presume to offend his neighbors with such smells for the future. The steward, conscious of his own innocence, replied with some warmth, "I know of no smells but those of your own making." This repartee introduced a smart dialogue, in which the Welshman undertook to prove, that, though the stench he complained of did not flow from the steward's own body, he was nevertheless the author of it, by serving out damaged provisions to the ship's company, and, in particular, putrefied cheese, from the use of which only, he affirmed, such unsavory steams could arise. Then he launched out into the praise of good cheese, of which he gave the analysis, explained the different kinds of that commodity, with the methods practiced to make and preserve it, concluded in observing, that, in yielding good cheese, the county of Glamorgan might vie with Cheshire itself, and was much superior to it in the produce of goats and butter. I gathered from this conversation, that, if I entered in my present pickle, I should be no welcome guest, and therefore desired Mr. Thompson to go before, and represent my calamity, at which the first mate, expressing some concern, went upon deck immediately, taking his way through the cable tier and the main hatchway, to avoid encountering me, desiring me to clean myself as soon as possible, for he intended to regale himself with a dish of salmagundy and a pipe. Accordingly, I set about this disagreeable business, and soon found I had more causes of complaint than I at first imagined, for I perceived some guests had honored me with their company, whose visit I did not think seasonable, neither did they seem inclined to leave me in a hurry, for they were in possession of my chief quarters, where they fed without reserve at the expense of my blood. But, considering it would be easier to extirpate the ferocious colony in the infancy of their settlement, than after they should be multiplied and naturalized to the soil, I took the advice of my friend, who, to prevent such misfortunes, went always close-shaved, and made the boy of our mess cut off my hair, which had been growing since I left the service of lavement, and the second mate lent me an old bob wig to supply the loss of that covering. This affair being ended, and everything adjusted in the best manner my circumstances would permit, the descendant of Caractacus returned, and, ordering the boy to bring a piece of salt beef from the brine, cut off a slice, and mixed it with an equal quantity of onions, which seasoning with a moderate proportion of pepper and salt, he brought it to a consistence with oil and vinegar, then, tasting the dish, assured us it was the best salmagundi that ever he made, and recommended it to our palate, with such heartiness that I could not help doing honor to his preparation. But I had no sooner swallowed a mouthful, than I thought my entrails were scorched, and endeavored with a deluge of small beer to allay the heat it occasioned. Supper being over, Mr. Morgan having smoked a couple of pipes, and supplied the moisture he had expended with as many cans of flip, of which we all partook, a certain yawning began to admonish me that it was high time to repair by sleep the injury I had suffered from want of rest the preceding night, which being perceived by my companions, whose time of repose was now arrived, they proposed we should turn in, or in other words, go to bed. Our hammocks, which hung parallel to one another, on the outside of the berth, were immediately unlashed, and I beheld my messmates spring with great agility into their respective nests, where they seemed to lie concealed, very much at their ease. But it was some time before I could prevail upon myself to trust my carcass at such a distance from the ground, in a narrow bag, out of which, I imagined, I should be apt, on the least motion in my sleep, to tumble down at the hazard of breaking my bones. I suffered myself, however, to be persuaded, and taking a leap to get in, threw myself quite over, with such violence, that had I not luckily got hold of Thompson's hammock, I should have pitched upon my head on the other side, and in all likelihood fractured my skull. After some fruitless efforts, I succeeded at last, but the apprehension of the jeopardy in which I believed myself withstood all the attacks of sleep till towards the morning watch, when, in spite of my fears, I was overpowered with slumber, though I did not long enjoy this comfortable situation, being aroused with a noise so loud and shrill, that I thought the drums of my ears were burst by it. This was followed by a dreadful summons pronounced by a hoarse voice, which I could not understand. While I was debating with myself, whether or not I should wake my companion and inquire into the occasion of this disturbance, I was informed by one of the quartermasters who passed by me with a lantern in his hand, that the noise which alarmed me was occasioned by the boatswain's mates who called up the larboard watch, and that I must lay my account with such an interruption every morning at the same hour. Being now more assured of my safety, I undressed myself again to rest, and slept till 8 o'clock, when rising, and breakfasting with my comrades on biscuit and brandy, the sick were visited and assisted as before, after which visitation my good friend Thompson explained and performed another piece of duty, to which I was a stranger. At a certain hour in the morning, the boy of the mess went round all the decks, ringing a small hand-bell, and, in rhymes composed for the occasion, invited all those who had sores to repair before the mast, where one of the doctor's mates attended, with applications to dress them. Chapter 27. I acquire the friendship of the surgeon, who procures a warrant for me, and makes me a present of clothes, a battle between a midshipman and me, the surgeon leaves the ship, the captain comes on board with another surgeon, a dialogue between the captain and Morgan, the sick are ordered to be brought upon the quarter-deck and examined, the consequences of that order, a madman accuses Morgan, and is set at liberty by command of the captain, whom he instantly attacks, and pummels without mercy, while I was busied with my friend in the practice. The doctor chanced to pass by the place where we were, and stopping to observe me appeared very well satisfied with my application, and afterward sent for me to his cabin, where, having examined me touching my skill in surgery, and the particulars of my fortune, he interested himself so far in my behalf, as to promise his assistance in procuring a warrant for me, seeing I had already been found qualified at Surgeon's Hall for the station I filled on board, and in this good office he the more cordially engaged when he understood I was nephew to Lieutenant Bowling, for whom he expressed a particular regard. In the meantime, I could learn from his discourse that he did not intend to go to sea again with Captain Oakham, having, as he thought, been indifferently used by him during the last voyage. While I lived tolerably easy, in expectation of preferment, I was not altogether without mortifications, which I not only suffered from the rude insults of the sailors and petty officers, among whom I was known by the name of Loblolly Boy, but also from the disposition of Morgan, who, though friendly in the main, was often very troublesome with his pride, which expected a good deal of submission from me, and delighted in recapitulating the favors I had received at his hands. About 6 weeks after my arrival on board, the surgeon, bidding me to follow him into his cabin, presented a warrant to me, by which I was appointed surgeon's third mate on board the Thunder. This he had procured by his interest at the Navy Office, as also another for himself, by virtue of which he was removed into a second rate. I acknowledged his kindness in the strongest terms my gratitude could suggest, and professed my sorrow at the prospect of losing so valuable a friend, to whom I hoped to have recommended myself still further, by my respectful and diligent behavior. But his generosity rested not here, for before he left the ship he made me a present of a chest and some clothes that enabled me to support the rank to which he had raised me. I found my spirit revive with my good fortune, and, now I was an officer, resolved to maintain the dignity of my station, against all opposition or affronts, nor was it long before I had occasion to exert my resolution. My old enemy, the midshipman, whose name was Crampley, entertaining an implacable animosity against me for the disgrace he had suffered on my account, had since that time taken all opportunities of reviling and ridiculing me, when I was not entitled to retort this bad usage, and, even after I had been rated on the books, and mustered as surgeon's mate, did not think fit to restrain his insolence. In particular, being one day present while I dressed a wound in a sailor's leg, he began to sing a song, which I thought highly injurious to the honor of my country, and therefore signified my resentment, by observing that the Scots always laid their account with finding enemies among the ignorant, insignificant, and malicious. This unexpected piece of assurance enraged him to such a degree, that he lent me a blow on the face, which I verily thought had demolished my cheekbone. I was not slow in returning the obligation, and the affair began to be very serious, when by accident Mr. Morgan, and one of the master's mates, coming that way, interposed, and, inquiring into the cause, endeavored to promote a reconciliation, but, finding us both exasperated to the uttermost, and bent against accommodation, they advised us either to leave our difference undecided, till we should have an opportunity of terminating it on shore, like gentlemen, or else choose a proper place on board, and bring it to an issue by boxing. The last expedient was greedily embraced by us both, and, being forthwith conducted to the ground proposed, we stripped in a moment, and began a furious contest, in which I soon found myself inferior to my antagonist, not so much in strength and agility, as in skill, which he had acquired in the school of Hockley in the Hole at Tottenham Court. Many cross buttocks did I sustain, and pegs on the stomach without number, till at last my breath being quite gone, as well as my vigor wasted, I grew desperate, and collecting all my strength in one effort, threw in at once, head, hands, and feet, with such violence, that I drove my antagonist 3 paces backward into the main hatchway, down which he fell, and pitching upon his head and right shoulder, remained without sense and motion. Morgan, looking down, and seeing him lie in that condition, cried, "Upon my conscience, as I am a Christian sinner, look you, I believe his patless are all over, but I take you all to witness that there was no treachery in the case, and that he has suffered by the chance of war." So saying he descended to the deck below, to examine into the situation of my adversary, and left me very little pleased with my victory, as I found myself not only terribly bruised, but likewise in danger of being called to account for the death of Crampley. But this fear vanished when my fellow-mate having, by bleeding him in the jugular, brought him to himself, and inquired into the state of his body, called up to me to be under no concern, for the midshipman had received no other damage. Then as pretty a luxation of the os humori as one would desire to see on a summer's day. Upon this information I crawled down to the cockpit, and acquainted Thompson with the affair, who, providing himself with bandages, etc., necessary for the occasion, went up to assist Mr. Morgan in the reduction of the dislocation. When this was successfully performed, they wished me joy of the event of the combat, and the Welshman, after observing, that, in all likelihood, the ancient Scots and Britons were the same people, bade me praise Cot for putting mettle in my pelly, and strength in my limbs to support it. I acquired such reputation by this rencontre, which lasted 20 minutes, that everybody became more cautious in behavior towards me, though Cramplay, with his arm in a sling, talked very high, and threatened to seize the first opportunity of retrieving on shore the honor he had lost by an accident, from which I could justly claim no merit. About this time, Captain Oakham, having received sailing orders, came on board, and brought along with him a surgeon of his own country, who soon made us sensible of the loss we suffered in the departure of Dr. Atkins, for he was grossly ignorant, and intolerably assuming, false, vindictive, and unforgiving, a merciless tyrant to his inferiors, an abject sycophant to those above him. In the morning after the captain came on board, our first mate, according to custom, went to wait on him with a sick list, which, when this grim commander had perused, he cried with a stern countenance, "Blood and cons. 61 sick people on board of my ship. Hark ye, you sir, I'll have no sick in my ship, by G.D. The Welshman replied, he should be very glad to find no sick people on board, but, while it was otherwise, he did no more than his duty in presenting him with a list. You and your list may be D.N.D., said the captain, throwing it at him. I say, there shall be no sick in this ship while I have the command of her. Mr. Morgan, being nettled at this treatment, told him his indignation ought to be directed to God Almighty, who visited his people with distempers, and not to him, who contributed all in his power towards their cure. The Bashaw, not being used to such behavior in any of his officers, was enraged to fury at this satirical insinuation, and, stamping with his foot, called him insolent scoundrel, threatening to have him pinioned to the deck, if he should presume to utter another syllable. But the blood of Caractacus being thoroughly heated, disdained to be restricted by such a command, and began to manifest itself in, Captain Oakham, I am a gentleman of birth and parentage, look you, and peradventure I am moreover. Here his harangue was broken off by the captain's steward, who, being Morgan's countryman, hurried him out of the cabin before he had time to exasperate his master to a greater degree, and this would certainly have been the case, for the indignant Welshman could hardly be hindered by his friend's arguments and entreaties from re-entering the presence chamber, and defying Captain Oakham to his teeth. He was, however, appeased at length, and came down to the berth, where, finding Thompson and me at work preparing medicines, he bade us leave off our lapart to go to play, for the captain, by his sole word, and power, and command, had driven sickness a-pegging to the tevil, and there was no more malady on board. So saying, he drank off a gill of brandy, sighed grievously 3 times, poured forth an ejaculation of, God bless my heart, liver, and lungs, and then began to sing a Welsh song with great earnestness of visage, voice, and gesture. I could not conceive the meaning of this singular phenomenon, and saw by the looks of Thompson, who at the same time shook his head, that he suspected poor Cadwallader's brains were unsettled. He, perceiving our amazement, told us he would explain the mystery, but at the same time bade us take notice, that he had lived poy, bachelor, married man, and widower, almost 40 years, and in all that time there was no man, nor mother's son in the whole world who durst use him so ill as Captain Oakham had done. Then he acquainted us with the dialogue that passed between them, as I have already related it, and had no sooner finished this narration than he received a message from the surgeon, to bring the sick list to the quarter-deck, for the captain had ordered all the patients thither to be reviewed. This inhuman order shocked us extremely, as we knew it would be impossible to carry some of them on the deck, without imminent danger of their lives, but, as we likewise knew it would be to no purpose for us to remonstrate against it, we repaired to the quarter-deck in a body, to see this extraordinary muster, Morgan observing by the way, that the captain was going to send to the other world a great many evidences to testify against himself. When we appeared upon deck, the captain bade the doctor, who stood bowing at his right hand, look at these lazy lubberly sons of bitches, who were good for nothing on board but to eat the king's provision, and encourage idleness in the skulkers. The surgeon grinned approbation, and, taking the list, began to examine the complaints of each as they could crawl to the place appointed. The first who came under his cognizance was a poor fellow just freed of a fever, which had weakened him so much that he could hardly stand. Mr. Mac Shane, for that was the doctor's name, having felt his pulse, protested he was as well as any man in the world, and the captain delivered him over to the boatswain's mate, with orders that he should receive a round dozen at the gangway immediately, for counterfeiting himself sick. But, before the discipline could be executed, the man dropped down on the deck, and had well nigh perished under the hands of the executioner. The next patient to be considered, labored under a quartan ague, and, being then in his interval of health, discovered no other symptoms of distemper than a pale meagre countenance and emaciated body, upon which he was declared fit for duty, and turned over to the boatswain, but, being resolved to disgrace the doctor, died upon the forecastle next day, during his cold fit. The third complained of a pleuritic stitch, and spitting of blood, for which Dr. Macshane prescribed exercise at the pump to promote expectoration. But whether this was improper for one in his situation, or that it was used to excess, I know not, but in less than half an hour he was suffocated with a deluge of blood that issued from his lungs. A fourth, with much difficulty, climbed to the quarter-deck, being loaded with a monstrous ascites, or dropsy, that invaded his chest so much, he could scarce fetch his breath, but his disease being interpreted into fat, occasioned by idleness and excess of eating, he was ordered, with a view to promote perspiration and enlarge his chest, to go aloft immediately. It was in vain for this unwieldy wretch to allege his utter incapacity. The boatswain's driver was commanded to whip him up with the cat and nine tails. The smart of this application made him exert himself so much, that he actually arrived at the puttock shrouds, but when the enormous weight of his body had nothing else to support than his weakened arms, either out of spite or necessity, he quitted his hold, and plunged into the sea, where he must have been drowned, had not a sailor, who was in a boat alongside, saved his life, by keeping him afloat till he was hoisted on board by a tackle. It would be tedious and disagreeable to describe the fate of every miserable object that suffered by the inhumanity and ignorance of the captain and surgeon, who so wantonly sacrificed the lives of their fellow creatures. Many were brought up in the height of fevers, and rendered delirious by the injuries they received in the way. Some gave up the ghost in the presence of their inspectors, and others, who were ordered to their duties, languished a few days at work among their fellows, and then departed without any ceremony. On the whole, the number of the sick was reduced to less than a dozen, and the authors of this reduction were applauding themselves for the services they had done to their king and country, when the boatswain's mate informed His Honor that there was a man below lashed to his hammock, by direction of the doctor's mate, and that he begged hard to be released, affirming he had been so maltreated only for a grudge Mr. Morgan bore him, and that he was as much in his senses as any man aboard. The captain, hearing this, darted a severe look at the Welshman, and ordered the man to be brought up immediately, upon which Morgan protested with great fervency that the person in question was as mad as a March hare, and begged for the love of God they would at least keep his arms pinioned during his examination, to prevent him from doing mischief. This request the commander granted for his own sake, and the patient was produced, who insisted upon his being in his right wits with such calmness and strength of argument, that everybody present was inclined to believe him, except Morgan, who affirmed there was no trusting to appearances, for he himself had been so much imposed upon by his behavior 2 days before, that he had actually unbound him with his own hands, and had well nigh been murdered for his pains. This was confirmed by the evidence of one of the waiters, who declared he had pulled this patient from the doctor's mate, whom he had gotten down, and almost strangled. To this the man answered, that the witness was a creature of Morgan's, and suborned to give his testimony against him by the malice of the mate, whom the defendant had affronted, by discovering to the people on board, that Mr. Morgan's wife kept a gin shop in Ragfair. This anecdote produced a laugh at the expense of the Welshman, shaking his head with some emotion, said, "Aye, 'tis no matter. Cot knows, it is an arrant falsehood." Captain Oakham, without any farther hesitation, ordered the fellow to be unfettered, at the same time, threatening to make Morgan exchange situations with him for his spite, but the Briton no sooner heard the decision in favor of the madman, than he got up to the mizzen shrouds, crying to Thompson and me to get out of his reach, for we should see him play the devil with a vengeance. We did not think fit to disregard his caution, and accordingly got up on the poop, whence we beheld the maniac, as soon as he was released, fly at the captain like a fury, crying, "I'll let you know, you scoundrel, that I am commander of this vessel," and pummel him without mercy. The surgeon, who went to the assistance of his patron, shared the same fate, and it was with the utmost difficulty that he was mastered at last, after having done great execution among those who opposed him. Chapter 28. The captain, enraged, threatens to put the madman to death with his own hand, is diverted from that resolution by the arguments and persuasion of the first lieutenant and surgeon. We set sail for St. Helens, join the fleet under the command of Sir C.O. Gle, and proceed for the West Indies, are overtaken by a terrible tempest. My friend Jack Ratlin has his leg broke by a fall from the main-yard. The behavior of Mr. Mackshane, Jack opposes the amputation of his limb, in which he is seconded by Morgan and me. We undertake the cure and perform it successfully. The captain was carried into his cabin, so enraged with the treatment he had received, that he ordered the fellow to be brought before him, that he might have the pleasure of pistoling him with his own hand, and would certainly have satisfied his revenge in this manner, had not the first lieutenant remonstrated against it, by observing that, in all appearances, the fellow was not mad, but desperate, that he had been hired by some enemy of the captain's to him, and therefore ought to be kept in irons till he could be brought to a court-martial, which, no doubt, would sift the affair to the bottom, by which means important discoveries might be made, and then sentence the criminal to a death according to his demerits. This suggestion, improbable as it was, had the desired effect upon the captain, being exactly calculated for the meriton of his intellects, more especially as Dr. Mackshane espoused this opinion, in consequence of his previous declaration that the man was not mad. Morgan, finding there was no more damage done, could not help discovering by his countenance the pleasure he enjoyed on this occasion, and, while he bathed the doctor's face with an embrocation, ventured to ask him whether he thought there were more fools or madmen on board. But he would have been wiser in containing this sally, which his patient carefully laid up in his memory, to be taken notice of at a more fit season. Meanwhile we weighed anchor, and, on our way to the Downs, the madman, who was treated as a prisoner, took an opportunity, while the sentinel attending him was at the head, to leap and frustrate the revenge of the captain. We stayed not long at the Downs, but took the benefit of the first easterly wind to go round to Spithead, where, having received provisions on board for 6 months, we sailed from St. Helens in the Grand Fleet bound for the West Indies, on the ever-memorable expedition of Carthagena. It was not without great mortification I saw myself on the point of being transported to such a distant and unhealthy climate, destitute of every convenience that could render such a voyage supportable, and under the dominion of an arbitrary tyrant, whose command was almost intolerable. However, as these complaints were common to a great many on board, I resolved to submit patiently to my fate, and contrived to make myself as easy as the nature of the case would allow. We got out of the channel with a prosperous breeze, which died away, leaving us becalmed about 50 leagues to the westward of the Lizard, but this state of inaction did not last long, for next night our maintopsail was split by the wind, which, in the morning, increased to a hurricane. I was awakened by a most horrible din, occasioned by the play of the gun carriages upon the decks above, the cracking of cabins, the howling of the wind through the shrouds, the confused noise of the ship's crew, the pipes of the boatswain and his mates, the trumpets of the lieutenants, and the clanking of the chain pumps. Morgan, who had never been at sea before, turned out in a great hurry, crying, "God have mercy and compassion upon us. I believe we have caught upon the confines of Lucifer and the D.&I., while poor Thompson lay quaking in his hammock, putting up petitions to heaven for our safety." I rose and joined the Welshman, with whom, after having fortified ourselves with brandy, I went above, but if my sense of hearing was startled before, how must my sight have been appalled in beholding the effects of the storm. The sea was swelled into billows mountain high, on the top of which our ship sometimes hung as if it were about to be precipitated to the abyss below. Sometimes we sank between 2 waves that rose on each side higher than our topmast head, and threatened by dashing together to overwhelm us in a moment. Of all our fleet, consisting of 150 sail, scarce 12 appeared, and these driving under their bare poles, at the mercy of the tempest. At length the mast of one of them gave way, and tumbled overboard with a hideous crash. Nor was the prospect in our own ship much more agreeable. A number of officers and sailors ran backward and forward with distraction in their looks, hallooing to one another, and undetermined what they should attend to first. Some clung to the yards, endeavoring to unbend the sails that were split into 1,000 pieces flapping in the wind. Others tried to furl those which were yet whole, while the masts, at every pitch, bent and quivered like twigs, as if they would have shivered into innumerable splinters. While I considered this scene with equal terror and astonishment, one of the main braces broke, by the shock whereof 2 sailors were flung from the yard's arm into the sea, where they perished, and poor Jack Rattlin thrown down upon the deck, at the expense of a broken leg. Morgan and I ran immediately to his assistance, and found a splinter of the shin bone thrust by the violence of the fall through the skin. As this was a case of too great consequence to be treated without the authority of the doctor, I went down to his cabin to inform him of the accident, as well as to bring up dressings which we always kept ready prepared. I entered his apartment without any ceremony, and, by the glimmering of a lamp, perceived him on his knees before something that very much resembled a crucifix, but this I will not insist upon, that I may not seem too much a slave to common report, which indeed assisted my conjecture on this occasion, by representing Dr. Mackshane as a member of the Church of Rome. Be this as it will, he got up in a sort of confusion, occasioned, I suppose, by his being disturbed in his devotion, and in a trice snatched the subject of my suspicion from my sight. After making an apology for my intrusion, I acquainted him with the situation of Rattlin, but could by no means prevail upon him to visit him on deck, where he lay. He bade me desire the boatswain to order some of the men to carry him down to the cockpit, and in the meantime, said he, I will direct Thompson to get ready the dressings. When I signified to the boatswain the doctor's desire, he swore a terrible oath, that he could not spare one man from deck, because he expected the mast would go by the board every minute. This piece of information did not at all contribute to my peace of mind, however, as my friend Rattlin complained very much. With the assistance of Morgan I supported him to the lower deck, whither Mr. Mackshane, after much entreaty, ventured to come, attended by Thompson, with a box full of dressings, and his own servant, who carried a whole set of capital instruments. He examined the fracture and the wound, and concluding, from a livid color extending itself upon the limb, that mortification would ensue, resolved to amputate the leg immediately. This was a dreadful sentence to the patient, who, recruiting himself with a quid of tobacco, pronounced with a waffle countenance, What? Is there no remedy, doctor? Must I be docked? Can't you splice it? Assuredly, Dr. Mackshane, said the first mate, with submission, and deference, and veneration, to your superior abilities, and opportunities, and stations. Look you, I do apprehend, and conjure, and aver, that there is no occasion nor necessity to smite off this poor man's leg. God Almighty bless you, dear Welshman, cried Rattlin, may you have fair wind and weather wheresoever you're bound, and come to an anchor in the road of heaven at last. Mackshane, very much incensed at his mate's differing in opinion from him, so openly, answered, that he was not bound to give an account of his practice to him, and in a peremptory tone, ordered him to apply the tourniquet. At the sight of which, Jack, starting up, cried, Avast, avast. And my heart, if you clap your nippers on me, till I know wherefore. Mr. Random, won't you lend a hand towards saving my precious limb? Odds heart, if Lieutenant Bowling was here, he would not suffer Jack Rattlin's leg to be chopped off like a piece of old junk. This pathetic address to me, joined to my inclination to serve my honest friend, and the reasons I had to believe there was no danger in delaying the amputation, induced me to declare myself of the first mate's opinion, and affirm that the preternatural color of the skin was owing to an inflammation, occasioned by a contusion, and common in all such cases, without any indication of an approaching gangrene. Morgan, who had a great opinion of my skill, manifestly exulted in my fellowship, and asked Thompson's sentiments in the matter, in hopes of strengthening our association with him too, but he, being of a meek disposition, and either dreading the enmity of the surgeon, or speaking the dictates of his own judgment, in a modest manner espoused the opinion of Mackshane, who by this time having consulted with himself, determined to act in such a manner as to screen himself from censure, and at the same time revenge himself on us, for our arrogance in contradicting him. With this view, he asked if we would undertake to cure the leg at our peril, that is, be answerable for the consequence. To this question, Morgan replied, that the lives of his creatures are at the hands of God alone, and it would be great presumption in him to undertake for an event that was in the power of his Maker, no more than the doctor could promise to cure all the sick to whom he administered his assistance, but if the patient would put himself under our direction, we would do our endeavor to bring his distemper to a favorable issue, to which at present we saw no obstruction. I signified my concurrence, and Rattlin was so overjoyed that, shaking us both by the hands, he swore nobody else should touch him, and, if he died, his blood should be upon his own head. Mr. Mackshane, flattering himself with the prospect of our miscarriage, went away, and left us to manage it as we should think proper. Accordingly, having sawed off part of the splinter that stuck through the skin, we reduced the fracture, dressed the wound, applied the 18-tailed bandage, and put the leg in a box, secundum artem. Everything succeeded according to our wish, and we had the satisfaction of not only preserving the poor fellow's leg, but likewise of rendering the doctor contemptible among the ship's company, who had all their eyes on us during the course of this cure, which was completed in 6 weeks. Chapter 29, Mackshane's Malice. I am taken up and imprisoned for a spy. Morgan meets with the same fate. Thompson is tampered with to turn evidence against us, disdains the proposal, and is maltreated for his integrity. Morgan is released to assist the surgeon during an engagement with some French ships of war. I remain fettered on the poop, exposed to the enemy's shot, and grow delirious with fear. Am comforted after the battle by Morgan, who speaks freely of the captain, is overheard by the sentinel, who informs against him, and again imprisoned. Thompson grows desperate, and, notwithstanding the remonstrances of Morgan and me, goes overboard in the night. In the meantime the storm subsided into a brisk gale, that carried us into the warm latitudes, where the weather became intolerable, and the crew very sickly. The doctor left nothing unattempted towards the completion of his vengeance against the Welshman and me. He went among the sick under pretence of inquiring into their grievances, with a view of picking up complaints to our prejudice, but, finding himself frustrated in that expectation by the goodwill we had procured from the patients by our diligence and humanity, he took the resolution of listening to our conversation, by hiding himself behind the canvas that surrounded our berth. Here too he was detected by the boy of our mess, who acquainted us with this piece of behavior, and one night, while we were picking a large bone of salt beef, Morgan discerned something stir on the outside of our hangings, which immediately interpreting to be the doctor, he tipped me the wink, and pointed to the place, where I could perceive somebody standing, upon which, I snatched up the bone, and levelled it with all my force at him, saying, "Whoever you are, take that for your curiosity." It had the desired effect, for we heard the listener tumble down, and afterwards crawl to his own cabin. I applauded myself much for this feat, which turned out one of the most unlucky exploits of my life. Mackshane, from that time, marking me out for destruction. About a week after this exploit, as I was going my rounds among the sick, I was taken prisoner, and carried to the poop by the master-at-arms, where I was loaded with irons, and stapled to the deck, on pretence that I was a spy on board, and had conspired against the captain's life. How ridiculous soever this imputation was, I did not fail to suffer by it all the rigor that could be shown to the worst of criminals, being exposed in this miserable condition to the scorching heat of the sun by day, and the unwholesome damps by night, during the space of 12 days, in which I was neither brought to trial, nor examined touching the probability of the charge. I had no sooner recovered the use of my reflection, which had been quite overthrown by this accident, than I sent for Thompson, who, after condoling me on the occasion, hinted, that I owed this misfortune to the hatred of the doctor, who had given an information against me to the captain, in consequence of which I was arrested, and all my papers seized. While I was cursing my capricious fate, I saw Morgan ascend the poop, guarded by 2 corporals, who made him sit down by me, that he might be pinioned in the same machine. Notwithstanding my situation, I could scarce refrain from laughing at the countenance of my fellow prisoner, who, without speaking one word, allowed his feet to be enclosed in the rings provided for that purpose, but, when they pretended to fasten him on his back, he grew outrageous, and drawing a large couteau from his side pocket, threatened to rip up the belly of the first man that should approach him, in order to treat him in such an unworthy manner. They were prepared to use him very roughly, when the lieutenant on the quarter-deck called up to them to let him remain as he was. He then crept towards me, and, taking me by the hand, bade me put my trust in Cot. And looking at Thompson, who sat by us trembling, with a pale visage, told him there were 2 more rings for his feet, and he should be glad to find him in such good company. But it was not the intention of our adversary to include the second mate in our fate. Him he expected to be his drudge in attending the sick and, if possible, his evidence against us. With this view he sounded him afar off, but, finding his integrity incorruptible, harassed him so much out of spite, that in a short time this mild creature grew weary of his life. While I and my fellow prisoner comforted each other in our tribulation, the admiral discovered 4 sail to leeward and made signal for our ship and 4 more to chase. Hereupon everything was cleared for an engagement, and Mac Shane, foreseeing he should have occasion for more assistance than one, obtained Morgan's liberty, while I was let in this deplorable posture to the chance of battle. It was almost dark when we came up with the sternmost chase, which we hailed, and inquired who they were. They gave us to understand they were French men of war, upon which Captain Oakham commanded them to send their boat on board of him. But they refused, telling him, if he had any business with them, to come on board of their ship. He then threatened to pour in a broadside upon them, which they promised to retain. Both sides were as good as their word, and the engagement began with great fury. The reader may guess how I passed my time, lying in this helpless situation, amidst the terrors of a sea fight, expecting every moment to be cut asunder, or dashed in pieces by the enemy's shot. I endeavored to compose myself as much as possible, by reflecting that I was not a whit more exposed than those who were stationed about me, but, when I beheld them employed without intermission in annoying the foe, and encouraged by the society and behavior of one another, I could easily perceive a wide difference between their condition and mine. However, I concealed my agitation as well as I could till the head of the officer of marines who stood near me, being shot off, bounced from the deck athwart my face, leaving me well nigh blinded with brains. I could contain myself no longer, but began to bellow with all the strength of my lungs, when a drummer, coming towards me, asked if I was wounded, and, before I could answer, received a great shot in his belly, which tore out his entrails, and he fell flat on my breast. This accident entirely bereft me of all discretion. I redoubled my cries, which were drowned in the noise of the battle, and, finding myself disregarded, lost all patience, and became frantic. I vented my rage in oaths and execrations, till my spirits, being quite exhausted, I remained quiet, as insensible of the load that oppressed me. The engagement lasted till broad day, when Captain Oakham, finding he was like to gain neither honor nor advantage by the affair, pretended to be undeceived by seeing their colors, and, hailing the ship whom he had fought all night, protested he believed them Spaniards, and the guns being silenced on each side, ordered the barge to be hoisted out, and went on board the French Commodore. Our loss amounted to 10 killed, and 18 wounded, most part of whom afterwards died. My fellow-mates had no sooner dispatched their business in the cockpit, than, full of friendly concern, they came to visit me. Morgan, ascending first, and seeing my face almost covered with brains and blood, concluded I was no longer a man for this world, and, calling to Thompson with great emotion, bade him come up, and take his last farewell of his comrade and countryman, who was posted to a better place, where there were no Mac Shanes nor Oakhams to asperse and torment him. "No," said he, taking me by the hand, "you are going to a country where there is more respect shown to unfortunate gentlemen, and where you will have the satisfaction of beholding your adversaries tossing upon pillows of burning brimstone." Thompson, alarmed at this apostrophe, made haste to the place where I lay, and sitting down by me, with tears in his eyes inquired into the nature of my calamity. By this time I had recollected myself so far as to be able to converse rationally with my friends, whom, to their great satisfaction, I immediately undeceived with regard to their apprehension of my being mortally wounded. After I had got myself disengaged from the carnage in which I wallowed, and partaken of a refreshment which my friends brought along with them, we entered into discourse upon the hardships we sustained, and spoke very freely of the author of our misery. But our discourse being overheard by the sentinel who guarded me, he was no sooner relieved than he reported to the captain every syllable of our conversation, according to the orders he had received. The effect of this information soon appeared in the arrival of the master-at-arms, who replaced Morgan in his former station, and gave the second mate a caution to keep a strict guard over his tongue, if he did not choose to accompany us in our confinement. Thompson, foreseeing that the whole slavery of attending the sick and wounded, as well as the cruelty of Mac Shane, must now fall upon his shoulders, grew desperate at the prospect, and, though I never heard him swear before, imprecated dreadful curses on the heads of his oppressors, declaring that he would rather quit life altogether than be much longer under the power of such barbarians. I was not a little startled at his vivacity, and endeavored to alleviate his complaints, by representing the subject of my own, with as much aggravation as it would bear, by which comparison he might see the balance of misfortune lay on my side, and take an example from me of fortitude and submission, till such time as we could procure redress, which I hoped was not far off, considering that we should probably be in a harbor in less than 3 days, where we should have an opportunity of preferring our complaints to the admiral. The Welshman joined in my remonstrance, and was at great pains to demonstrate that it was every man's duty as well as interest to resign himself to the divine will, and look upon himself as a sentinel upon duty, who is by no means at liberty to leave his post before he is relieved. Thompson listened attentively to what he said, and at last, shedding a flood of tears, shook his hand, and left us without making any reply. About 11 at night he came to see us again with a settled gloom on his countenance, and gave us to understand that he had undergone excessive toil since he saw us, and in recompense had been grossly abused by the doctor, who taxed him with being confederate with us, in a design of taking away his life and that of the captain. After some time spent in mutual exhortation, he got up, and squeezing me by the hand with uncommon fervor, cried, "God bless you both," and left us to wonder at his singular manner of parting with us, which did not fail to make a deep impression on us both. Next morning, when the hour of visitation came round, the unhappy young man was missing, and, after strict search, supposed to have gone overboard in the night, and this was certainly the case. Chapter 30. We lament the fate of our companion. The captain offers Morgan his liberty, which he refuses to accept. We are brought before him and examined. Morgan is sent back into custody, whither also I am remanded after a curious trial. The news of this event affected my fellow prisoner and me extremely, as our unfortunate companion had justly acquired by his amiable disposition the love and esteem of us both, and the more we regretted his untimely fate, the greater horror we conceived for the villain who was undoubtedly the occasion of it. This abandoned miscreant did not discover the least symptom of concern for Thompson's death, although he must have been conscious to himself of having driven him by ill usage to the fatal resolution, but desired the captain to set Morgan at liberty again to look after the patients. Accordingly one of the corporals was sent up to unfetter him, but he protested he would not be released until he should know for what he was confined, nor would he be a tennis ball, nor a shuttlecock, nor a trudge, nor a scullion, to any captain under the sun. Oakham, finding him obstinate, and fearing it would not be in his power to exercise his tyranny much longer with impunity, was willing to show some appearance of justice and therefore ordered us both to be brought before him on the quarter-deck, where he sat in state, with his cleric on one side, and his counsellor Mac Shane on the other. When we approached, he honoured us with this salutation: "So, gentlemen, and my blood. Many a captain in the navy would have ordered you both to be tucked up to the yard's arm, without either judge or jury, for the crimes you have been guilty of, but, and my blood, I have too much good nature in allowing such dogs as you to make defence." "Captain Oakham," said my fellow sufferer, "certainly it is in your power, God help the while, to tack us all up at your will, desire, and pleasures. And perhaps it would be better for some of us to be tucked up than to undergo the miseries to which we have been exposed. So may the farmer hang his kids for his diversion, and amusement, and mirth, but there is such a thing as justice, if not upon earth, surely in heaven, that will punish with fire and brimstone all those who take away the lives of innocent people out of wantonness and barbarity. Look you. In the meantime, I shall be glad to know the crimes laid to my charge, and see the person who accuses me." "That you shall," said the captain. "Here, doctor, what have you to say?" Mac Shane, stepping forward, hemmed a good while, in order to clear his throat, and, before he began, Morgan accosted him thus: "Dr. Mac Shane, look in my face, look in the face of an honest man, who abhors a false witness as he abhors the devil, and caught be judge between you and me." The doctor, not minding this conjuration, made the following speech: "As near as I can remember, I'll tell you what, Mr. Morgan, to be sure what you say is just, in regard to an honest man, and if so be it appears as how you are an honest man, then it is my opinion that you deserve to be acquitted, in relation to that there affair, for I tell you what, Captain Oakham is resolved for to do everybody justice. As for my own part, all that I have to allege is, that I have been informed you have spoken disrespectful words against your captain, who, to be sure, is the most honorable and generous commander in the king's service, without asparagement or except ion of man, woman, or child." Having uttered this elegant harangue, on which he seemed to plume himself, Morgan replied: "I do partly guess, and conceive, and understand your meaning, which I wish could be more explicit, but, however, I do suppose, I am not to be condemned upon bare hearsay, or, if I am convicted of speaking disrespectfully of Captain Oakham, I hope there is no treason in my words. But there's mutiny, by G.D., and that's death by the Articles of War," cried Oakham. "In the meantime, let the witnesses be called." Hereupon Mac Shane's servant appeared, and the boy of our mess, whom they had seduced and tutored for the purpose. The first declared, that Morgan as he descended the cockpit ladder one day, cursed the captain, and called him a savage beast, saying, he ought to be hunted down as an enemy to mankind. About 11 at night he came to see us again with a settled gloom on his countenance, and gave us to understand that he had undergone excessive toil since he saw us, and in recompense had been grossly abused by the doctor, who taxed him with being confederate with us, in a design of taking away his life and that of the captain. After some time spent in mutual exhortation, he got up, and squeezing me by the hand with uncommon fervor, cried, "God bless you both," and left us to wonder at his singular manner of parting with us, which did not fail to make a deep impression on us both. Next morning, when the hour of visitation came round, the unhappy young man was missing, and, after strict search, supposed to have gone overboard in the night, and this was certainly the case. Chapter 30. We lament the fate of our companion. The captain offers Morgan his liberty, which he refuses to accept. We are brought before him and examined. Morgan is sent back into custody, whither also I am remanded after a curious trial. The news of this event affected my fellow prisoner and me extremely, as our unfortunate companion had justly acquired by his amiable disposition the love and esteem of us both, and the more we regretted his untimely fate, the greater horror we conceived for the villain who was undoubtedly the occasion of it. This abandoned miscreant did not discover the least symptom of concern for Thompson's death, although he must have been conscious to himself of having driven him by ill usage to the fatal resolution, but desired the captain to set Morgan at liberty again to look after the patients. Accordingly one of the corporals was sent up to unfetter him, but he protested he would not be released until he should know for what he was confined, nor would he be a tennis ball, nor a shuttlecock, nor a trudge, nor a scullion, to any captain under the sun. Oakham, finding him obstinate, and fearing it would not be in his power to exercise his tyranny much longer with impunity, was willing to show some appearance of justice and therefore ordered us both to be brought before him on the quarter-deck, where he sat in state, with his cleric on one side, and his counsellor Mac Shane on the other. When we approached, he honored us with this salutation: "So, gentlemen, and my blood. Many a captain in the Navy would have ordered you both to be tucked up to the yard's arm, without either judge or jury, for the crimes you have been guilty of, but, and my blood, I have too much good nature in allowing such dogs as you to make defense." "Captain Oakham," said my fellow sufferer, "certainly it is in your power, God help the while, to tack us all up at your will, desire, and pleasures. and perhaps it would be better for some of us to be tucked up than to undergo the miseries to which we have been exposed. So may the farmer hang his kids for his diversion, and amusement, and mirth, but there is such a thing as justice, if not upon earth, surely in heaven, that will punish with fire and brimstone all those who take away the lives of innocent people out of wantonness and barbarity. Look you. In the meantime, I shall be glad to know the crimes laid to my charge, and see the person who accuses me. That you shall, said the captain. Here, doctor, what have you to say? Mac Shane, stepping forward, hemmed a good while, in order to clear his throat, and, before he began, Morgan accosted him thus: Dr. Mac Shane, look in my face, look in the face of an honest man, who abhors a false witness as he abhors the devil, and caught be judge between you and me. The doctor, not minding this conjuration, made the following speech: as near as I can remember, I'll tell you what, Mr. Morgan, to be sure what you say is just, in regard to an honest man, and if so be it appears as how you are an honest man, then it is my opinion that you deserve to be acquitted, in relation to that there affair, for I tell you what, Captain Oakham is resolved for to do everybody justice. As for my own part, all that I have to allege is, that I have been informed you have spoken disrespectful words against your captain, who, to be sure, is the most honorable and generous commander in the king's service, without asparagement or exception of man, woman, or child. Having uttered this elegant harangue, on which he seemed to plume himself, Morgan replied: I do partly guess, and conceive, and understand your meaning, which I wish could be more explicit, but, however, I do suppose, I am not to be condemned upon bare hearsay, or, if I am convicted of speaking disrespectfully of Captain Oakham, I hope there is no treason in my words. But there's mutiny, by G.D., and that's death by the Articles of War, cried Oakham. In the meantime, let the witnesses be called. Hereupon Mac Shane's servant appeared, and the boy of our mess, whom they had seduced and tutored for the purpose. The first declared, that Morgan as he descended the cockpit ladder one day, cursed the captain, and called him a savage beast, saying, he ought to be hunted down as an enemy to mankind. This, said the clerk, is a strong presumption of a design, formed against the captain's life. For why? It presupposes malice aforethought, and a criminal intention a priori. Right, said the captain to this miserable grub, who had been an attorney's boy, you shall have law enough, here's Cook and Littlejohn to it. This evidence was confirmed by the boy, who affirmed, he heard the first mate say, that the captain had no more bowels than a bear, and the surgeon had no more brain than an ass. Then the sentinel, who heard our discourse on the poop, was examined, and informed the court that the Welshman assured me, Captain Oakham and Dr. Mac Shane would toss upon billows of burning brimstone in hell for their barbarity. The clerk observed, that there was an evident prejudication, which confirmed the former suspicion of a conspiracy against the life of Captain Oakham, because, how could Morgan so positively pronounce that the captain and surgeon would D.N.D., unless he had intention to make away with them before they could have time to repent? This sage explanation had great weight with our noble commander, who exclaimed, what have you to say to this, Taffy? You seem to be taken all aback, brother, ha. Morgan was too much of a gentleman to disown the text, although he absolutely denied the truth of the comment. Upon which the captain, strutting up to him with a ferocious countenance, said, so Mr. Son of a bitch, you confess you honored me with the names of bear and beast, and pronounced my damnation? D.N. my heart. I have a good mind to have you brought to a court-martial and hanged, you dog. Here Mac Shane, having occasion for an assistant, interposed, and begged the captain to pardon Mr. Morgan with his wonted goodness, upon condition that he the delinquent should make such submission as the nature of his misdemeanor demanded. Upon which the Cambro Briton, who on this occasion would have made no submission to the great mogul, surrounded with his guards, thanked the doctor for his mediation, and acknowledged himself in the wrong for calling the image of God a beast, but, said he, I spoke by metaphor, and parable, and comparison, and types, as we signify meekness by a lamb, lechery by a goat, and craftiness by a fox, so we liken ignorance to an ass, and brutality to a bear, and fury to a tiger, therefore I made use Of these similes to express my sentiments, look you, and what I said before caught, I will not unsay before man nor peace neither. Oakham was so provoked at this insolence, as he termed it, that he ordered him forthwith to be carried to the place of his confinement, and his clerk to proceed on the examination of me. The first question put to me was touching the place of my nativity, which I declared to be the north of Scotland. The north of Ireland more like, cried the captain, but we shall bring you up presently. He then asked what religion I professed, and when I answered the Protestant, swore I was an arrant Roman as ever went to mass. Come, clerk, continued he, catechize him a little on this subject. But before I relate the particulars of the clerk's inquiries, it will not be amiss to inform the reader that our commander himself was an Hibernian, and, if not shrewdly belied, a Roman Catholic to boot. You say, you are a Protestant, said the clerk, make the sign of the cross with your finger, so, and swear upon it to that affirmation. When I was about to perform the ceremony, the captain cried with some emotion, No, me. I'll have no profanation in either. But go on with your interrogations. Well then, proceeded my examiner, how many sacraments are there? To which I replied, 2. What are they? Said he. I answered, baptism and the Lord's Supper. And so you would explode confirmation and marriage altogether, said Oakham. I thought this fellow was a rank Roman. The clerk, though he was bred under an attorney, could not refrain from blushing at this blunder, which he endeavored to conceal, by observing, that these decoys would not do with me, who seemed to be an old offender. He went on with asking, if I believed in transubstantiation, but I treated the notion of real presence with such disrespect, that his patron was scandalized at my impiety, and commanded him to proceed to the plot. Whereupon this miserable pettifogger told me, there was great reason to suspect me of being a spy on board, and that I had entered into a conspiracy with Thompson and others not yet detected, against the life of Captain Oakham, which accusation they pretended to support by the evidence of our boy, who declared he had often heard the deceased Thompson and me whispering together, and could distinguish the words, Oakham, rascal, poison, pistol, by which expressions it appeared, we did intend to use sinister means to accomplish his destruction. That the death of Thompson seemed to confirm this conjecture, who, either feeling the stings of remorse for being engaged in such a horrid confederacy, or fearing a discovery, by which he must have infallibly suffered an ignominious death, had put a fatal period to his own existence. But what established the truth of the whole was, a book in ciphers found among my papers, which exactly tallied with one found in his chest, after his disappearance. This, he observed, was a presumption very near positive proof, and would determine any jury in Christendom to find me guilty. In my own defense, I alleged, that I had been dragged on board at first very much against my inclination, as I could prove by the evidence of some people now in the ship, consequently could have no design of becoming spy at that time, and ever since had been entirely out of the reach of any correspondence that could justly entail that suspicion upon me. As for conspiring against my captain's life, it could not be supposed that any man in his right wits would harbor the least thought of such an undertaking, which he could not possibly perform without certain infamy and ruin to himself, even if he had all the inclination in the world. That, allowing the boy's evidence to be true, which I affirmed was false and malicious, nothing conclusive could be gathered from a few incoherent words, neither was the fate of Mr. Thompson a circumstance more favorable for the charge, for I had in my pocket a letter which too well explained that mystery, in a very different manner from that which was supposed. With these words, I produced the following letter, which Jack Ratlin brought to me the very day after Thompson disappeared, and told me it was committed to his care by the deceased, who made him promise not to deliver it sooner. The clerk, taking it out of my hand, read aloud the contents, which were these: Dear friend, I am so much oppressed with the fatigue I daily and nightly undergo, and the barbarous usage of Dr. Mackshane, who is bent on your destruction as well as mine, that I am resolved to free myself from this miserable life, and, before you receive this, shall be no more. I could have wished to die in your good opinion, which I am afraid I shall forfeit by the last act of my life, but, if you cannot acquit me, I know you will at least preserve some regard for the memory of an unfortunate young man who loved you. I recommend it to you, to beware of Mac Shane, whose revenge is implacable. I wish all prosperity to you and Mr. Morgan, to whom pray offer my last respects, and beg to be remembered as your unhappy friend and countryman, William Thompson. This letter was no sooner read, than Mac Shane, in a transport of rage, snatched it out of the clerk's hands, and tore it into 1,000 pieces, saying, it was a villainous forgery, contrived and executed by myself. The captain and clerk declared themselves of the same opinion, although I insisted of having the remains of it compared with other writings of Thompson, which they had in their possession, and I was ordered to answer the last article of my accusation, namely, the book of ciphers found among my papers. That is easily done, said I. What you are pleased to call ciphers, are no other than the Greek characters, in which, for my amusement, I keep a diary of everything remarkable that has occurred to my observation since the beginning of the voyage, till the day in which I was put in irons, and the same method was practiced by Mr. Thompson, who copied mine. A very likely story, cried Mac Shane. What occasion was there for using Greek characters, if you were not afraid of discovering what you had wrote? But what d'ye talk of Greek characters? D'ye think I am so ignorant of the Greek language, as not to distinguish its letters from these, which are no more Greek than Chinese? No, no, I will not give up my knowledge of the Greek for you, nor none that ever came from your country. So saying, with an unparalleled effrontery, he repeated some gibberish, which by the sound seemed to be Irish, and made it pass for Greek with the captain, who, looking at me with a contemptuous sneer, exclaimed, "Ah, ah! Have you caught a Tartar?" I could not help smiling at the consummate assurance of this Hibernian, and offered to refer the dispute to anybody on board who understood the Greek alphabet. Upon which Morgan was brought back, and, being made acquainted with the affair, took the book, and read a whole page in English, without hesitation, deciding the controversy in my favor. The doctor was so far from being out of countenance at this detection, that he affirmed Morgan was in the secret, and repeated from his own invention. Oakham said, I see they are both in a story, and dismissed my fellow mate to his cockloft, although I proposed that he and I should read and translate, separately, any chapter or verse in the Greek Testament in his possession, by which it would appear whether we or the surgeon spoke truth. Not being endued with eloquence enough to convince the captain that there could be no juggle nor confederacy in this expedient, I begged to be examined by some unconcerned person on board, who understood Greek. Accordingly, the whole ship's company, officers and all, were called upon deck, among whom it was proclaimed that, if any one of them could speak Greek, he or they so qualified should ascend the quarter-deck immediately. After some pause, 2 foremast men came up, and professed their skill in that language, which, they said, they acquired during several voyages to the Levant, among the Greeks of the Morea. The captain exulted much in this declaration, and put my journal book into the hands of one of them, who candidly owned he could neither read nor write. The other acknowledged the same degree of ignorance, but pretended to speak the Greek lingo with any man on board, and, addressing himself to me, pronounced some sentences of a barbarous corrupted language, which I did not understand. I asserted that the modern Greek was as different from that spoken and written by the ancients, as the English used now from the old Saxons spoke in the time of Hengist, and, as I had only learned the true original tongue, in which Homer, Pindar, the evangelists, and other great men of antiquity wrote, it could not be supposed that I should know anything of an imperfect Gothic dialect that rose on the ruins of the former, and scarce retained any traces of the old expression. But, if Dr. Mac Shane, who pretended to be master of the Greek language, could maintain a conversation with these seamen, I would retract what I had said, and be content to suffer any punishment he should think proper to inflict. I had no sooner uttered these words than the surgeon, knowing one of the fellows to be his countryman, accosted him in Irish, and was answered in the same brogue. Then a dialogue ensued between them, which they affirmed to be in Greek, after having secured the secrecy of the other tar, who had his cue in the language of the Morea, from his companion, before they would venture to assert such an intrepid falsehood. I thought, said Oakham, we should discover the imposture at last. Let the rascal be carried back to his confinement. I find he must dangle. Having nothing further to urge in my own behalf, before a court so prejudiced with spite, and fortified with ignorance against truth, I suffered myself to be reconducted peaceably to my fellow prisoner, who, hearing the particulars of my trial, lifted up his hands and eyes to heaven, and uttered a dreadful groan, and, not daring to disburden his thoughts to me by speech, lest he might be overheard by the sentinel, burst forth into a Welsh song, which he accompanied with 1,000 contortions of face and violent gestures of body.